In a bustling city filled with towering skyscrapers and historical landmarks, there lived a man named Malcolm Carter. He was a distinguished gentleman in his mid-30s, with deep brown skin, a sharp mind, and a heart full of passion for history and the arts. Despite his immense success in the business world, Malcolm remained humble, never flaunting his wealth or status. From a young age, he had been fascinated by history, particularly the untold stories of Black pioneers who had shaped civilizations but were often forgotten by mainstream narratives. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, Malcolm had worked tirelessly to achieve his dreams. Through perseverance, intelligence, and an unyielding determination, he had become a highly respected entrepreneur and philanthropist, investing in education, culture, and historical preservation. His love for art and history extended beyond mere admiration. He was actively involved in museum funding, art preservation, and educational programs for underprivileged children. He believed in the power of knowledge, understanding that history held the key to a more just and enlightened society. Despite his accomplishments, Malcolm never sought the spotlight. He dressed in a refined yet understated manner, classic suits, well-polished shoes, and a demeanor that exuded quiet confidence. He did not need extravagant displays to assert his presence. His knowledge and poise spoke for him. This particular afternoon, Malcolm decided to visit a renowned museum, one that he had secretly supported for years. It housed artifacts of immense cultural significance, many of which he had personally helped acquire. But today, he was just another visitor, another curious mind eager to explore the treasures of the past. Little did he know that his presence would soon stir an unexpected reaction, leading to a series of events that would challenge perceptions, reveal hidden biases, and ultimately deliver a powerful lesson on humility, respect, and justice. The museum stood as a grand testament to history, its towering columns and intricate stone carvings exuding an air of prestige and timelessness. It was one of the most renowned institutions in the country, home to priceless artifacts, rare manuscripts, and exquisite works of art that spanned centuries. Tourists, scholars, and art enthusiasts from around the world flocked to this place, eager to immerse themselves in its vast collections and uncover the secrets of the past. Inside, the atmosphere was solemn, almost sacred. Soft, ambient lighting illuminated the carefully curated exhibits, casting gentle glows on ancient relics encased in glass. The halls stretched endlessly, their marble floors polished to perfection, reflecting the grandeur of the high, domed ceilings adorned with classical frescoes. Every detail, from the meticulously labeled artifacts to the well-preserved sculptures, spoke of a place deeply committed to history, culture, and knowledge. The museum staff carried themselves with an air of professionalism. Dressed in tailored uniforms, they moved about with precision, ensuring that visitors followed the rules. No flash photography, no touching the exhibits, and certainly no disruptive behavior. Security guards stood at strategic locations, their watchful eyes scanning the crowd for anything out of place. Though their primary duty was to protect the priceless collections, their presence also served as an unspoken reminder that this was a place of order, discipline, and quiet reverence. Visitors wandered through the halls, speaking in hushed tones as they admired the displays. Some stood mesmerized before colossal statues from ancient civilizations, while others leaned in close to study delicate scrolls that had withstood the passage of time. In one corner, a group of students took notes eagerly as their professor explained the significance of an artifact. In another, an elderly couple reminisced about their past travels to distant lands where they had seen similar treasures in their original settings. Despite the diverse crowd, there was an underlying exclusivity to the place, an unspoken rule that only those who truly belonged could fully appreciate its offerings. It was a place where intellectuals and collectors mingled, where discussions of provenance and artistic significance flowed effortlessly among those deemed cultured enough to understand. And today, into this revered institution walked Malcolm Carter. Unassuming, poised, and deeply knowledgeable, he stepped through the grand entrance, unaware that his presence would soon stir waves of judgment and reveal the hidden biases lurking beneath the museum's polished surface. As Malcolm Carter stepped through the grand entrance of the museum, the cool, conditioned air greeted him, contrasting sharply with the warmth of the afternoon sun outside. He moved with quiet confidence, his polished leather shoes making soft, measured steps against the marble floor. Though his attire was understated, it exuded an effortless elegance: dark slacks, a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, and a modest yet sophisticated watch that hinted at his refined taste. He didn't dress to impress, nor did he need to. He had long learned that true stature came not from the labels one wore but from the knowledge and wisdom one carried. Yet, in a place like this, appearances mattered, perhaps more than they should. As he entered the main hall, his eyes swept across the grand interior. It was a place he knew well, though today he experienced it not as a benefactor or a guest of honor, but as a regular visitor, anonymous, blending into the crowd. He preferred it this way. He wanted to experience the museum as any other guest would, to walk its corridors without the weight of expectation or recognition. Malcolm took his time, pausing before a vast tapestry that depicted an ancient kingdom's rise and fall. His gaze held appreciation, not just for its artistic beauty but for the untold stories woven into its threads. He stepped closer, studying the intricacy of the patterns, his mind piecing together the history that many overlooked. As he moved deeper into the museum, passing display cases filled with centuries-old artifacts, a few glances followed him. Some were fleeting, others lingered a little too long. He could feel the quiet scrutiny, the subtle questioning that danced in their eyes. A passing museum staff member, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and an air of practiced professionalism, barely concealed his curiosity. His gaze flickered over Malcolm's attire, his expression neutral but guarded. He gave a small, obligatory nod before continuing down the hall, but the message was clear. He had taken note of Malcolm's presence. Malcolm was used to this. It was not new to him, the silent judgment, the careful evaluations, the way people hesitated just a fraction longer than necessary when they saw someone like him in a place like this. But he remained unbothered. He had learned long ago that time and patience had a way of revealing the truth. With a quiet breath, he turned his attention back to the exhibits, fully immersing himself in the history before him. He had come to learn, to appreciate, and to lose himself in the wonders of the past. What others thought of him did not matter. Not yet. As Malcolm moved deeper into the museum, he paused in front of an elaborate display featuring artifacts from an ancient civilization. His eyes traced the delicate engravings on a bronze shield, his mind effortlessly recalling the historical context surrounding its origin. He admired the craftsmanship, the intricate patterns that told stories of warriors and kings long gone. A few steps away, behind the polished mahogany information desk, a museum staff member observed him with a watchful gaze. She was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in the standard navy blue museum uniform, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. At first, she simply glanced at him, as she would any visitor. But after a moment, her gaze lingered a little too long. There was something in the way Malcolm carried himself, confident yet reserved, that made her hesitate. She took in his dark skin, his well-tailored but unflashy clothes, and the way he moved deliberately from one artifact to the next. He wasn't taking hurried photos like the tourists. He wasn't following a guide. He was studying the exhibits with the kind of quiet intensity usually reserved for scholars or collectors. Yet something about him unsettled her. She leaned slightly toward her colleague, a younger man at the desk, and whispered something under her breath. He glanced at Malcolm, then back at her, his expression shifting subtly. With a discreet motion, she nodded toward a nearby security guard. The guard, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, caught her signal. He followed her gaze toward Malcolm, studying him for a brief moment before adjusting his stance. He didn't approach, at least not yet, but his posture changed. He stood straighter, his hand resting lightly near the radio on his belt, ready to act if needed. Malcolm, still engrossed in the exhibit, sensed the shift in the room before he even saw it. It was a skill he had honed over the years, an awareness that came from experience, from countless silent judgments passed in his direction. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, the subtle tightening of the atmosphere. Lifting his gaze from the artifact, he turned slightly, catching sight of the staff members at the desk. The woman quickly looked away, pretending to busy herself with a clipboard. The security guard, however, didn't divert his gaze. His eyes met Malcolm's, not hostile but assessing, measuring. Malcolm had seen this look before. It was the look of someone deciding if he belonged in a place like this. Without a word, Malcolm exhaled softly and turned back to the display. He had no intention of proving himself to anyone. If they wanted to watch him, let them. Soon enough, they would learn who he truly was. Malcolm continued moving through the exhibit, his gaze shifting between the artifacts and the small, finely printed plaques describing their origins. He took his time, appreciating the delicate craftsmanship, the centuries of history encased within these relics. His fingers hovered just above the glass case protecting a beautifully carved ceremonial mask, admiring the intricate details without touching. A shadow moved into his peripheral vision. A museum staff member, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and an air of quiet authority, approached with measured steps. His name tag read, Mr. Whitaker. His expression was neutral, but there was a stiffness in his demeanor, a certain hesitancy in his approach. "Can I help you?" The words were polite in theory, but the tone was anything but welcoming. It was the kind of question that wasn't truly an offer of assistance, but rather a request for explanation. His eyes flickered over Malcolm's attire, then back up to his face, as if trying to gauge whether he was a tourist, a researcher, or something else entirely. Malcolm turned to him with a calm, collected expression. "No, thank you. Just admiring the collection," he said, his voice steady and warm. Mr. Whitaker didn't leave. He shifted slightly, positioning himself between Malcolm and the next section of the exhibit. "These artifacts are quite rare," he said. "Some of them date back thousands of years. We try to keep them in pristine condition." Malcolm arched a brow slightly, recognizing the implication. "I can see that. The preservation work is impressive," he replied smoothly. "Whoever curated this exhibit has an excellent understanding of historical significance." Whitaker's expression flickered with something unreadable, perhaps surprised that Malcolm spoke with such familiarity about the artifacts. But instead of engaging in conversation, he kept his arms crossed. "We usually have guided tours available. Most guests find them helpful." Malcolm gave a small, knowing smile. "I appreciate that, but I prefer to take my time." There was a brief silence. The museum employee hesitated, as if debating whether to push further. Finally, he nodded curtly. "All right then, enjoy your visit." His words were polite, but his tone was dismissive. As he walked away, Malcolm could still feel the weight of his gaze. The moment was brief, but the message had been clear. His presence here was being noted, evaluated, and quietly questioned. But Malcolm was unshaken. He had encountered these moments before, where a person's curiosity turned into quiet suspicion, where assumptions were made before words were even exchanged. He had learned long ago that patience had a way of unraveling such biases. With a slow exhale, he turned back to the artifacts, his appreciation for history undisturbed. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Malcolm moved further down the exhibit hall, his steps slow and deliberate as he continued to absorb the history displayed before him. He stopped in front of an ornate display case featuring a collection of ancient gold jewelry, delicate necklaces, intricately carved bracelets, and ceremonial rings that once belonged to nobility. The exhibit label detailed how these artifacts had been discovered in a forgotten tomb, a glimpse into a civilization's wealth and craftsmanship. As he examined the exhibit, he became subtly aware of eyes lingering on him. A few feet away, a well-dressed elderly couple stood observing him with barely concealed curiosity. The man, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, whispered something to his wife, who wore an elegant pearl necklace and a silk scarf draped over her shoulders. Her lips pursed slightly as she turned to glance at Malcolm, then just as quickly averted her gaze, as if acknowledging him too openly would be improper. Not far from them, a younger couple, clearly well off, judging by the designer labels they wore, exchanged glances. The woman's expression was one of mild amusement, while the man's held something closer to skepticism. He folded his arms, tilting his head slightly as if trying to decipher why Malcolm was here alone, lingering over displays instead of moving along like the typical tourist. Malcolm had experienced this kind of silent evaluation before. It was not outright hostility, nothing as crude as open confrontation, but there was an unspoken question behind their looks. Does he belong here? It was an assumption woven so deeply into their perception that they likely didn't even realize they were doing it. In a place like this, where wealth, status, and quiet elitism often dictated the invisible social rules, someone like Malcolm, dressed simply yet tastefully, standing alone and immersed in the artifacts, did not fit the usual mold. He could feel their glances grazing over him like whispers in the air. A passing older gentleman, likely a collector or donor, eyed Malcolm with a brief but unmistakable flicker of disapproval before redirecting his attention toward the nearby museum curator. Malcolm, ever composed, did not react. He had long mastered the art of remaining unbothered by such things. Instead, he casually moved to the next exhibit, a display of ancient manuscripts. He traced the delicate inked characters with his eyes, genuinely absorbed in the knowledge preserved within them. But even as he read, he was aware of the subtle shifts in the room, the occasional murmurs, the sideways glances that followed him as he continued his exploration. The unspoken message was clear. Asterisk, they were watching him, judging him, questioning him. Asterisk. But soon, they would come to see him in a very different light. Malcolm moved past the scrutinizing glances and into the heart of the museum, where the exhibits grew even more exquisite. The deeper he ventured, the richer the history became. Grand tapestries hung from the walls, their vibrant colors preserved across centuries. Majestic sculptures stood in silent testimony to the artistry of civilizations long gone. Each artifact told a story, some well-documented, others shrouded in mystery. He walked deliberately, pausing in front of a collection of ancient scrolls encased in temperature-controlled glass. The delicate parchment, inscribed with flowing scripts, bore the marks of scholars who had once labored over them by candlelight. Malcolm leaned in slightly, studying the faded ink. He recognized the script immediately. It belonged to a lost civilization whose contributions to science and philosophy had been largely overlooked in modern history books. His fingers hovered just above the plaque detailing the exhibit, his mind working faster than his eyes could scan the words. He had spent years researching this civilization, fascinated by its forgotten advancements. He knew that few truly understood the significance of what was displayed before them. Yet, as he stood there, fully immersed in thought, he heard a voice nearby, a casual remark from a passing visitor. "Looks interesting," a man muttered to his companion. "I wonder if any of this is actually real or just overhyped." Malcolm smirked slightly but said nothing. He had heard such dismissive attitudes before, people underestimating the value of cultures they knew little about. He continued walking, moving toward the next section of the museum, where a grand display case stood beneath the soft glow of overhead spotlights. Inside rested a singular artifact, one that made him stop in his tracks. It was an ornate, ancient scepter. The artifact gleamed under the light, its surface encrusted with emeralds and gold filigree. The craftsmanship was unparalleled, the details intricate and purposeful. But what caught Malcolm's attention wasn't just its beauty. It was the history behind it. This scepter had once belonged to a powerful ruler, one whose influence had stretched across vast territories. Historians often spoke of the grandeur of his reign but overlooked the deeper layers of his leadership, the wisdom, the reforms, the cultural shifts he had inspired. Malcolm had studied this very artifact before, though never in person. He had read journals, research papers, and rare accounts detailing its origins. Yet, seeing it up close now, he felt something stir within him, a connection to the past that few others could appreciate. A museum guide stood a few feet away, explaining the artifact's importance to a small group of visitors. "This scepter symbolizes authority and divine right," the guide said. "It was once thought to possess mystical properties, and some legends claim it was used in sacred ceremonies. Historians believe it was crafted over 1,000 years ago, though its exact origins remain debated. Malcolm listened but found himself silently correcting some of the details. The guide was reciting what was publicly known, but Malcolm knew there was more. Details only a handful of researchers had uncovered. For a brief moment, he considered speaking up, adding a piece of knowledge that even the guide might not be aware of. But he hesitated. Would they welcome his insight, or would it be dismissed as speculation from an unexpected source? As he pondered, another figure approached. It was the same staff member from earlier, Mr. Whitaker. His presence was no coincidence. He had been keeping an eye on Malcolm, and now, seeing him fixated on one of the museum's most prized possessions, he decided to intervene once again. This time, Malcolm knew the conversation would take a different tone, and he was ready for it. Malcolm remained engrossed in the details of the ancient scepter, his mind tracing its journey through time, the rulers who had once held it, the decisions it had influenced. The weight of history pressed upon him, not in a burdensome way, but with the deep respect of someone who understood its significance. Then came an interruption. A new voice, sharp and professional, cut through the quiet hum of the museum. "Excuse me, sir," said a woman in a neatly pressed uniform, her badge identifying her as Ms. Reynolds. She was younger than Mr. Whitaker, perhaps in her early 30s, with a clipped tone that suggested efficiency, perhaps too much of it. Malcolm turned, offering a polite nod. "Yes." Ms. Reynolds' eyes flicked toward the scepter, then back to him. "This particular exhibit is part of our premium collection," she said. "We usually reserve closer access for our VIP guests." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Closer access?" He gestured lightly toward the glass case. "I'm behind the same rope as everyone else." Her lips pressed together in a thin line. "Of course," she said quickly. "It's just that these artifacts are quite valuable, and we typically encourage guests to explore the general exhibits unless they've purchased an upgraded tour." There it was, the unspoken message. Malcolm glanced around. The same elderly couple who had earlier observed him with mild curiosity were now pretending to examine another exhibit, though their ears were clearly attuned to the conversation. A few other visitors stole glances, sensing the growing tension. He met Ms. Reynolds' gaze, his expression calm but firm. "Are you suggesting I leave this section unless I pay extra?" She hesitated, momentarily thrown off by his composed response. "Not at all," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "I just wanted to ensure you were aware of our different tour options. Many of our more exclusive patrons prefer." Malcolm chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I see. And are all guests approached with this information? Or just me?" A brief silence stretched between them. Ms. Reynolds straightened, realizing the weight of his question. She began, then stopped, her professionalism faltering. Malcolm held her gaze for a moment longer before offering her an easy smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you for the information," he said smoothly, "but I think I'll continue my visit as planned." Ms. Reynolds exhaled, nodding stiffly. "Of course. Enjoy your visit," she said, her voice suddenly lacking the sharpness it had carried before. She turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Malcolm sighed quietly, returning his attention to the exhibit. The moment had passed, but the taste of it lingered. He had been questioned, subtly nudged toward the exit, and only when he challenged it did the situation dissolve. Little did they know, they were speaking to someone whose contributions to this very museum far exceeded the price of any VIP tour. But the time for revelations would come soon enough. Malcolm lingered a moment longer, allowing the tension of the previous exchange to settle. He had encountered situations like this before, subtle, quiet dismissals dressed as procedural formality. He had hoped, just for once, to enjoy a visit without feeling the weight of unspoken assumptions. But it seemed the museum had other plans. He turned to move toward the next exhibit when a large figure stepped into his path. A museum security guard, clad in a dark navy uniform, stood before him with a stance that suggested he wasn't just making casual rounds. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and a no-nonsense expression. His name tag read Henderson. "Sir," the guard said, his voice firm but measured, "I need to ask you a few questions." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "About what?" Henderson's gaze flicked briefly to the scepter behind him, then back to Malcolm. "We've received reports of unusual behavior near some of our high-value exhibits." Malcolm let out a quiet breath, his patience thinning. "Unusual behavior?" he repeated. "I was admiring the artifacts. Is that considered unusual now?" Henderson didn't flinch. "For security reasons, we sometimes verify guest credentials in sensitive exhibit areas," he said. "If you wouldn't mind, could I see some ID?" Malcolm studied him. The words were neutral, but the implication was clear. They wanted to confirm whether he had any legitimate reason to be here, whether he was a patron, an academic, or just someone who had wandered in from the street. He glanced around the room. Several visitors had paused their museum tour, pretending to examine nearby displays but clearly tuning in to the exchange. A woman adjusted her pearl necklace, casting quick, darting glances. An elderly man folded his arms, watching with quiet intrigue. Malcolm turned back to the guard. "Tell me," he said smoothly, "do you ask every guest to show their ID, or just the ones who look like me?" Henderson stiffened, but his expression remained professional. "Sir, I'm just following protocol." Malcolm chuckled softly. "Right, protocol." His voice held no anger, just a quiet understanding of how these situations usually played out. He reached into his blazer pocket, withdrawing his wallet with slow, deliberate movements. He wasn't about to give them any excuse to escalate this further. Pulling out his driver's license, he handed it to the guard. Henderson took it, inspecting it carefully, his eyes scanning the name. For a brief moment, a flicker of something crossed his face. Recognition, perhaps, but it disappeared just as quickly. Malcolm folded his arms. "Anything else?" Henderson hesitated. He seemed to realize that whatever assumption had led him here might have been misplaced. But now, having engaged, he couldn't back down so easily. "I appreciate your cooperation," the guard said finally, handing back the ID. "Enjoy your visit." Malcolm took his license, sliding it back into his wallet with practiced ease. He met the guard's gaze, holding it for just a beat longer than necessary. "Oh, I intend to." Henderson gave a curt nod and stepped back, but the moment left a mark. The energy in the room had shifted. Some visitors looked away awkwardly, others watched with curiosity. The tension was undeniable. Malcolm exhaled and turned back to the exhibits. He had played their game as he had done so many times before, but something inside him knew this was far from over. Malcolm took a slow breath, steadying himself. The moment had passed, but the sting of it remained. He had done nothing wrong, only observed, only admired, only existed in a space where some clearly felt he did not belong. But he was not here to argue, nor would he let their assumptions dictate his experience. Instead of walking away, he turned his attention back to the scepter. The security guard, Henderson, remained nearby, pretending to check his radio but clearly still watching. Other visitors whispered in hushed tones, stealing glances in his direction. Malcolm let a small smile curve his lips. If they were going to question his presence, he would give them a reason to listen. He gestured toward the scepter, speaking loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This piece," he said, his voice calm and measured, "is one of the finest surviving examples of early dynastic craftsmanship." Henderson blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. Malcolm continued, his gaze never leaving the artifact. "Most people assume it's purely ceremonial, but if you look closely at the grip here," he pointed just above the base encased in glass, "you'll see the subtle indentations. Those are stress marks, meaning this wasn't just a symbol of power. It was wielded, likely in battle." A small murmur rippled through the nearby guests. Even a few staff members, including Ms. Reynolds, had subtly moved closer, their curiosity piqued. The museum guide, the same one who had been giving a rehearsed speech about the artifact earlier, hesitated before stepping forward. "That's an interesting theory," he said cautiously. "But historians generally believe the ruler in question was not a warrior." Malcolm turned to him with an easy expression. "That's a common belief, yes," he acknowledged. "But recently discovered manuscripts suggest otherwise. Some recovered texts describe him as a tactician who led several key military campaigns. The marks on this scepter match descriptions of an item mentioned in those texts." The guide looked momentarily uncertain. "That's not something in our official records." Malcolm shrugged. "It wouldn't be. The findings were only published in a limited academic journal last year, not widely circulated." Silence stretched for a moment. The museum guide shifted, now eyeing Malcolm with something closer to respect than doubt. Ms. Reynolds frowned slightly, processing this new information. The wealthy couple from earlier, who had been quietly observing the scene, exchanged glances. Henderson, still standing close, cleared his throat. "You seem to know quite a bit about this." Malcolm chuckled lightly, turning to him. "You could say that. I have a personal interest in these artifacts." He let his words linger, deliberately vague. For the first time since the confrontation began, the balance of power shifted. Now it was they who were unsure of him. Malcolm offered them all a polite smile and turned back to the exhibit, resuming his quiet admiration. "Let them wonder." A brief silence hung in the air, thick with unspoken thoughts. Malcolm remained poised, his expression unreadable as he studied the museum guide and Ms. Reynolds, who now looked slightly unsettled. Henderson, the security guard, had relaxed his stance, but his presence lingered, a reminder that Malcolm was still under quiet scrutiny. Ms. Reynolds was the first to break the silence. She forced a small, professional smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's quite an interesting perspective," she said, her voice carefully measured. "Though, of course, our official records rely on verified academic sources." Malcolm didn't flinch. "And what makes a source verified?" he asked smoothly. "Is it time, recognition, or just who's allowed to speak on the subject?" The question hung between them, uncomfortably so. A few visitors nearby, drawn in by the unexpected exchange, lingered just outside the conversation's reach, their curiosity piqued. The museum guide cleared his throat. "Well," he said hesitantly, "as you may know, we work with leading historians and institutions. The information we present has been peer-reviewed and carefully curated for accuracy." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "And yet, history is constantly evolving. New discoveries reshape old narratives all the time. What we believe to be true today may change tomorrow." He gestured toward the scepter. "That ruler wasn't always recognized for his military leadership, was he?" Early records focused solely on his political influence, dismissing the idea that he had any direct involvement in warfare. But later findings, like the ones I mentioned, suggest otherwise. The guide hesitated, clearly unprepared to be challenged. Ms. Reynolds pursed her lips, arms folding subtly across her chest. "You seem very confident in your claims," she remarked. "But unless you're a historian yourself, I'm not sure where you're getting this information." Malcolm smiled faintly. "I make it a habit to stay informed." He let the words settle before adding, "Besides, history belongs to everyone. No degree or title should determine who is allowed to engage with it." That struck a nerve. The guide shifted uncomfortably, while Ms. Reynolds' expression hardened just slightly. There was an unspoken resistance in her posture, the subtle refusal to acknowledge his knowledge as legitimate. "I understand your enthusiasm," she said, her tone edging toward condescension. "But this museum has strict guidelines on factual representation. We encourage discussion, of course, but our exhibits are based on well-established academic consensus." Malcolm exhaled slowly, nodding as if he had expected this response. "Consensus," he echoed. "Interesting word. It implies agreement among those given the authority to decide. But consensus isn't always the truth, is it?" Ms. Reynolds hesitated just a moment too long before replying. "Sir, if you have concerns about our historical interpretations, I'd be happy to provide resources from our research team. Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head slightly. That won't be necessary. The museum guide, sensing the tension, quickly tried to shift gears. Regardless, it's great to see visitors engaging with the exhibits at this level, he said, forcing a polite chuckle. Most people just take a quick glance and move on. Malcolm studied them both for a moment. He could see it now, the way they were trying to sidestep, to redirect, to dismiss without outright confrontation. They weren't interested in a discussion. They were interested in maintaining control of the narrative. And that was fine. He had no intention of pushing further. Not yet. Instead, he simply smiled. A slow, knowing smile that unsettled them more than any argument could. I appreciate the conversation, he said lightly. It's always fascinating to hear different perspectives. With that, he turned away, letting the moment hang. Behind him, Ms. Reynolds exhaled, clearly relieved that the discussion had ended. The museum guide adjusted his tie, exchanging a brief glance with her as if to silently ask, "Who is this guy?" They still didn't know, but soon enough they would. Malcolm took one last look at the museum guide and Ms. Reynolds before turning his full attention back to the scepter. The glass case reflected the museum's dim lighting, casting a soft glow over the artifact. He let out a thoughtful hum, then spoke. This time, not as someone responding to skepticism, but as someone who knew the story better than the museum itself. This scepter, he began, his voice smooth and assured, is over 1,000 years old, originating from the central dynastic period of the Kingdom of Amari. It belonged to Emperor Joran II, a ruler known not just for his political acumen, but for his strategic brilliance in warfare, something often overlooked in modern historical discourse. A small murmur rippled through the few lingering visitors. The museum guide shifted uncomfortably. Malcolm continued, his tone steady. The gold filigree along the shaft suggests that it was reforged at least once during his reign, likely after the unification wars between the northern and southern provinces. You can see it in the subtle inconsistencies in the etching pattern, evidence that the lower half was reconstructed using a slightly different technique than the upper portion. He stepped closer to the display, not touching the glass but gesturing toward the artifact. Those emeralds embedded in the hilt? They aren't just for decoration. The Amari people believe that green gemstones symbolize divine favor, which means the scepter wasn't merely ceremonial. It was likely used in sacred anointing rituals before battles. In fact, the early scrolls found in the ruins of Otar mention a rod of kings that was carried into every major conflict during Joran II's reign. Cross-referencing those descriptions with the dimensions of this piece leaves little doubt. This is the very same artifact. He paused, letting his words settle, watching as the museum staff exchanged uneasy glances. He could see it now, the way the guide's brow furrowed, the way Ms. Reynolds' lips pressed into a thin line. They were listening, but they were also resisting. Finally, the guide spoke, his voice hesitant. That's quite a detailed assessment. Malcolm smiled. History is about details. If we ignore them, we risk misinterpreting the past. The weight of his words lingered. A few nearby visitors who had initially watched in idle curiosity were now fully engaged, whispering among themselves. Some stole glances at the museum's official plaque beside the exhibit, silently comparing Malcolm's explanation to what had been printed. Ms. Reynolds cleared her throat. "That's an interesting perspective," she said carefully. "But as I mentioned earlier, our records are based on verified sources." Malcolm chuckled lightly. "And yet, some of those sources are incomplete. That's the nature of history, isn't it? It's always evolving." Silence stretched between them. The museum staff had come to question him, to subtly push him out. But now, they were the ones uncertain, the ones grasping for control of a narrative they had assumed was theirs to tell. Malcolm had just taken the first step in shifting that power. And he wasn't done yet. As the tension lingered between Malcolm and the museum staff, a new presence entered the conversation. A woman in her late 50s, dressed in an elegant yet understated outfit. She had been admiring a nearby display but had gradually inched closer, drawn in by Malcolm's confident discourse. Her silver-rimmed glasses rested low on her nose, and her expression was one of keen curiosity. "Pardon me," she interjected, her voice warm but inquisitive. "I couldn't help but overhear. You seem to know quite a bit about this artifact." Malcolm turned to her, offering a polite nod. "I've done my share of research." The woman glanced at the museum guide, then back at Malcolm. "You mentioned the ruins of Otar," she said. "That's fascinating. I read an article a few years ago suggesting that those ruins held religious significance beyond what was originally believed. Do you think that ties into the scepter's function?" Malcolm's smile deepened. Here was someone who wasn't dismissing him. Someone who, instead of questioning whether he belonged in this conversation, was eager to learn. "Absolutely," he said. "Most early accounts describe the scepter as merely symbolic, but new findings suggest it was used in both political and religious ceremonies. The markings near the base match inscriptions found on temple pillars in Otar, symbols representing divine authority and military leadership. That combination is rare in artifacts of this era, which tells us that Joran II wasn't just a ruler. He was considered a warrior prophet of sorts." The woman's eyes lit up. "That makes so much sense," she murmured. "I always wondered why artifacts from that period carried dual-purpose iconography. The traditional records never fully explained it." She turned toward the museum guide, who had been standing stiffly, clearly out of his depth. "Do your records reflect any of this?" she asked. The guide hesitated. "Well," he began, flustered, "our information is based on what has been widely accepted by historians." The woman gave him a knowing look. "History has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" she mused, before returning her attention to Malcolm. "You wouldn't happen to be a historian yourself, would you?" Malcolm chuckled. "Not officially, but history has always been a passion of mine." She nodded approvingly. Passion often leads to the best discoveries. More visitors had started to gather now, sensing that something was unfolding beyond the usual museum tour experience. A few leaned in, trying to catch bits of the conversation. Malcolm could see it, the shift. A moment ago, he had been questioned, scrutinized. Now, people were listening, engaging, learning. The museum staff, however, were growing increasingly uneasy. They had tried to dismiss him, yet now he was commanding the room in a way they hadn't expected. And this was only the beginning. The museum guide forced a tight smile, his discomfort barely concealed. He could feel the energy in the room shifting. What had begun as a quiet dismissal of Malcolm had turned into an impromptu lesson, and worse yet, the guests were paying attention. This was no longer just an isolated exchange. Ms. Reynolds, standing a few feet away, exhaled sharply before stepping forward. "That's all very interesting," she said, her tone still polite but now laced with an edge of skepticism. "But of course, much of what you're saying isn't officially documented in our exhibits. We have a responsibility to ensure that our information is based on widely accepted historical research." The older woman who had engaged with Malcolm frowned slightly. "But isn't historical research always evolving?" she countered. "If this young man has referenced newer findings, shouldn't we at least consider them?" The museum guide cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "There's a difference between considering alternative perspectives and presenting speculation as fact," he said, his words directed more at Malcolm than at the guests. Malcolm simply smiled, unbothered by the subtle dismissal. "You assume I'm speculating," he said calmly, "but I can cite the sources if you'd like." That caught them off guard. Ms. Reynolds hesitated, but she recovered quickly. "And where exactly did you come across this information?" she asked, skepticism still evident in her voice. "Did you read it in a blog? A documentary, perhaps?" It was a thinly veiled attempt to discredit him, to imply that he was simply someone who had stumbled across half-formed theories on the internet and was now playing expert. Malcolm didn't take the bait. Instead, he reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few quick taps, he navigated to a digital archive and held up the screen. "The Journal of Antiquities," he said casually. "This article discusses the re-examination of artifacts found at the ruins of Otar, including the inscription patterns that match those on the scepter." The museum guide's face tightened. He recognized the name. It was a legitimate academic publication, respected in historical circles. But Malcolm wasn't finished. He swiped again, revealing another journal. And here's a research paper from Dr. Elaine Cartwright, one of the leading historians in early dynastic civilizations. She presented this theory at the International Historical Symposium last year. Ms. Reynolds' expression faltered for just a second. Malcolm smiled knowingly. "I don't just read about history," he said smoothly. "I study it." The tension thickened. The museum staff had tried to dismiss him, to reduce his knowledge to nothing more than casual interest. But now, faced with hard evidence, they were running out of ways to undermine him. The small crowd that had gathered around was now watching the exchange intently. Some guests whispered among themselves, glancing at Malcolm with newfound respect. Yet despite the undeniable truth in front of them, Ms. Reynolds and the guide still hesitated. They weren't ready to acknowledge him, not fully, because that would mean admitting they had been wrong. Malcolm could see it now, the quiet battle playing out in the expressions of the museum staff. The guide and Ms. Reynolds exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence visibly shaken. They had assumed he was just another visitor with a passing interest in history, someone they could dismiss with polite indifference. But now, faced with undeniable evidence, they found themselves cornered. The gathered guests, sensing the tension, whispered among themselves. Some looked at Malcolm with admiration, while others cast disapproving glances toward the staff, silently questioning their treatment of him. The air in the room had shifted. Malcolm exhaled slowly, then made a decision. "Clearly," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we're at an impasse." Ms. Reynolds straightened, as if preparing for another round of polite deflection. "Sir, I don't think. I'd like to speak with the museum director," Malcolm interrupted smoothly. Now, a ripple of surprise passed through the gathered visitors. The museum guide stiffened, his fingers twitching as if debating how to respond. Ms. Reynolds' jaw tightened. "That won't be necessary," she said quickly. "We're more than capable of handling any concerns you have." Malcolm smiled faintly. "I'm sure you are," he said. "But given the circumstances, I'd prefer to discuss this directly with someone in charge. That shouldn't be a problem, should it?" Ms. Reynolds hesitated for a fraction too long. It was clear she wanted to refuse, to brush him off as she had before. But now, under the watchful eyes of guests who were starting to question the museum's professionalism, she had no choice. "Very well," she said, her voice clipped. "I'll notify the director." She turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the restricted staff area, her posture tense. The museum guide, still visibly unsettled, muttered something about resuming his tour and quickly excused himself. Malcolm remained where he was, patiently waiting. The gathered visitors didn't move either. Some stayed out of curiosity, others out of quiet support. A soft voice broke the silence. "You handled that well." Malcolm turned to see the older woman, the one who had first engaged him in discussion about the scepter. She was watching him with an approving expression. "It's not the first time I've had to," Malcolm said lightly, though there was an edge of truth beneath his words. She gave a small nod, understanding. "They didn't expect you to challenge them." Malcolm chuckled. "They didn't expect me to know more than they did." She smiled at that but said nothing more. Minutes passed. Then the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall. A well-dressed man in his 60s appeared, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit impeccably tailored. His name tag read, Thomas Langley, Museum Director. Ms. Reynolds followed close behind, her expression unreadable. Mr. Langley stopped in front of Malcolm, offering a professional but guarded smile. "I was told there was a concern," he said evenly. "How can I assist you?" Malcolm studied Thomas Langley for a brief moment before responding. The museum director exuded the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to authority. His posture was upright, his expression composed, and his gaze steady but calculating. He was polite, but there was something behind his eyes, a silent evaluation, a weighing of whether Malcolm was worth his time. Langley offered a measured smile, the kind one might give to an insistent patron who had caused just enough commotion to warrant attention but not enough to command genuine concern. I understand you had some questions about one of our exhibits, Langley said, his voice even. I'd be happy to address any concerns you may have. Malcolm could tell he was choosing his words carefully. The director's tone was professional, yet it carried an underlying hint of skepticism. He wasn't here because he thought there was a real issue. He was here to placate, to smooth over whatever misunderstanding had led to this moment. Malcolm remained composed. I appreciate your time, Mr. Langley, he said, his voice calm but firm. I've been admiring your collection, particularly the scepter from the Kingdom of Amari. It's a remarkable piece, but I noticed some inconsistencies in the historical description provided in your exhibit. Langley arched a brow, as if he hadn't expected such a direct and knowledgeable statement. Oh, he said mildly, and what inconsistencies would those be? Malcolm gestured toward the scepter's display. Your museum identifies this as a purely ceremonial artifact, yet recent findings suggest otherwise. The wear patterns, the reinforced lower half, and documented historical accounts point to it being actively used in battle as well as in royal ceremonies. The inscriptions on the hilt align with texts uncovered in the ruins of Otar, confirming its connection to Emperor Joran II's military campaigns. Langley blinked, his polite expression slipping just slightly before he quickly masked it. That's quite a claim, he said, his tone still controlled. Our records are based on extensive research from leading historians in the field. Malcolm nodded. And I assume those historians are familiar with Dr. Elaine Cartwright's recent work? The one where she cross-referenced the engravings on the scepter with early Amari battlefield relics. A flicker of something passed over Langley's face. Something close to irritation, though he hid it well. Dr. Cartwright's theories are certainly interesting, he admitted, but they remain a matter of academic debate. We prefer to present only widely accepted research in our exhibits. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. So you're aware of her findings, but you've chosen to omit them? Langley's lips pressed together in a thin line. Museums have a responsibility to provide visitors with well-established historical facts, he said. We can't base our exhibits on every emerging hypothesis. Malcolm chuckled softly. Of course, but when emerging hypotheses are supported by concrete evidence, shouldn't they at least be acknowledged? Langley's expression remained neutral, but Malcolm could see the subtle shift in his demeanor. He was growing impatient, not because Malcolm was wrong, but because he hadn't expected to be challenged so directly. I understand your passion for history, Langley said, his tone still carefully measured. But we have a team of experts who curate these exhibits with the utmost diligence. If you have concerns about the accuracy of our descriptions, I'd be happy to direct you to our research department. It was a dismissal, polite, professional, but unmistakably clear. Malcolm smiled, unfazed. That won't be necessary, he said smoothly, because I'm more than familiar with the research process. In fact, I've contributed to it. Langley's polite facade flickered again, just for a second. A hint of uncertainty, a crack in the assumption that Malcolm was just another guest with too many opinions. But still, the director remained unmoved. Even now, he didn't fully acknowledge him. But that was about to change. Malcolm held Langley's gaze for a moment, then exhaled softly, shaking his head with a small, knowing smile. He had given them time. Given them every opportunity to recognize what was happening, to realize that their assumptions had been misplaced. But they had chosen skepticism, chosen to see him as an outsider who didn't belong in their carefully curated world. Fine. If they wouldn't recognize him on their own, he would make them. Mr. Langley, Malcolm said smoothly, his tone still calm but carrying an undeniable weight. I respect the work that goes into maintaining a museum of this caliber. I understand the need for accuracy, for curation, for presenting history in a way that aligns with accepted research. Langley's lips parted slightly, as if readying a response, but Malcolm continued before he could speak. That's why I made sure that when I donated this artifact, it would be displayed with the respect it deserves. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Silence stretched across the room. Langley blinked, as if he had misheard. Excuse me? He said slowly. Malcolm turned slightly, gesturing toward the scepter behind the glass. "This scepter," he said, "was part of a private collection I acquired years ago. I donated it to this museum because I believed it belonged in the public eye, where people could learn from it." He let his gaze flick toward Ms. Reynolds and the museum guide before settling back on Langley. "I was under the impression that its full historical context would be represented accurately." A stunned murmur rippled through the gathered visitors. Some exchanged shocked glances, others simply gaped. Ms. Reynolds paled, her posture stiffening as the realization settled in. The museum guide, who had earlier dismissed Malcolm's knowledge, swallowed hard, his face flushing with quiet embarrassment. Langley, to his credit, maintained his composure barely. But there was no mistaking the shift in his expression, the flicker of realization that they had made a grave miscalculation. "You're saying," Langley began, then hesitated. "You're saying you're the benefactor responsible for this donation?" Malcolm nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Another ripple of murmurs swept through the bystanders. The older woman who had engaged Malcolm earlier let out a small, delighted laugh, shaking her head in admiration. "I had a feeling you weren't just another visitor," she murmured. Langley inhaled deeply, his carefully constructed professional facade beginning to crack. "Mr. Carter," he said finally, his voice quieter now, "I was unaware of—" Malcolm held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Let's be clear," he said, his voice even. "This isn't about whether or not you knew who I was. This is about the fact that from the moment I walked through those doors, I was treated as though I didn't belong. Questioned, scrutinized, dismissed." He gestured toward the museum staff. "I was approached, asked to provide ID, subtly nudged away from an exhibit I personally donated." Langley had no immediate response. The reality of the situation was dawning on him in full force now. Malcolm let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that held no malice, only certainty. "I came here today as a visitor," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "But make no mistake, I am also a patron of this institution, and as someone who has invested in its success, I expect better." The room remained still, every eye now on Langley. The power dynamic had shifted. Malcolm was no longer the one being evaluated. Now it was Langley and his staff who were on trial. A stunned silence filled the museum hall, thick with the weight of Malcolm's revelation. It was as if time itself had paused, leaving only the echoes of his words hanging in the air. Ms. Reynolds looked as if she had forgotten how to breathe. Her once confident posture had deflated, her eyes darting between Malcolm and the scepter, as if trying to reconcile the man she had subtly dismissed with the prestigious benefactor who had placed that very artifact in their care. The museum guide, who had previously questioned Malcolm's knowledge, now stood frozen in place, his earlier skepticism replaced with open embarrassment. He swallowed hard, shifting awkwardly, his hands fumbling with the hem of his jacket. Langley, ever the polished director, tried to maintain his composure, but the slight stiffening of his jaw betrayed his surprise. He adjusted his tie with a forced sense of control, his mind visibly racing to recover from the misstep. But the reactions that truly satisfied Malcolm were those of the surrounding guests. The wealthy couple who had once eyed him with curiosity, and perhaps mild suspicion, now looked at him with sheer disbelief. The older gentleman adjusted his glasses, blinking as if seeing Malcolm for the first time. His wife, once aloof, now regarded him with something that almost resembled admiration. The younger couple, who had previously exchanged amused glances about him, now shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting their earlier assumptions. And then there was the older woman, the one who had engaged him in thoughtful discussion about the scepter. She was the only one who didn't appear surprised. Instead, she smiled, a glint of quiet satisfaction in her eyes. "Well," she murmured, "I did suspect you knew more than you let on." A soft wave of murmurs spread through the crowd, whispers passing from person to person as they absorbed what had just unfolded. "This is incredible. He actually donated it?" They were questioning him like he was some ordinary guest. They treated him like he didn't belong. The realization struck hard, not just among the museum staff, but among the visitors who had witnessed it all. The weight of their collective judgment, their silent assumptions. It was all laid bare now, undeniable and uncomfortable. Malcolm, ever composed, allowed the moment to stretch, letting them sit with their own thoughts. He could see it in their faces, the shifting of perceptions, the slow, humbling realization that they had been wrong. Finally, Langley cleared his throat, forcing himself back into control. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice carefully measured, "I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred." The phrasing made Malcolm smirk. A misunderstanding. That was what they were calling it. But he said nothing, letting Langley flounder in the tension of the moment. Ms. Reynolds, still pale, opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, clearly at a loss. The museum guide, for once, had nothing to say. They had all misjudged him, and now they had to sit with that truth. The weight of silence in the room was almost suffocating. The once confident museum staff now stood visibly uncomfortable, their authority shattered in an instant. The air, once filled with quiet dismissal and silent judgment, now carried an undeniable truth. They had misjudged him, and worse yet, they had done so in front of an audience. Ms. Reynolds was the first to break. Her usual poised demeanor faltered as she inhaled deeply, visibly struggling with the words she knew she had to say. Her fingers tightened around the tablet she had been holding, and then, finally, she exhaled. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice quieter than before, I sincerely apologize for any undue scrutiny you faced during your visit today." Malcolm arched a brow slightly, waiting. She swallowed, hesitating for just a second before continuing. "It was never our intention to make you feel unwelcome. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We should have given you the respect you deserved from the beginning." Malcolm gave her a slow nod, acknowledging the effort, though he knew the apology came only because the truth had been forced into the open. The museum guide, the man who had dismissed Malcolm's knowledge so easily before, now looked utterly humiliated. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced with an uneasy stiffness. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I misjudged you," he admitted, glancing down briefly before forcing himself to meet Malcolm's gaze. I assumed that you were just another visitor making speculative claims. I didn't think—" He stopped, shaking his head. "No, that's not right. I did think. I thought you couldn't possibly know what you were talking about. And for that, I owe you an apology." There it was, the real truth. Not just an apology for the inconvenience, not just a half-hearted attempt to smooth things over, but an admission that bias, conscious or not, had dictated their actions. Malcolm held his gaze for a moment before offering a slow nod. "Acknowledging it is the first step," he said simply. The guide exhaled, nodding in return. He knew Malcolm could have humiliated him further, could have made this moment even more painful, but instead, he had given him the dignity of letting him own up to his mistake. Then all eyes turned to Langley. The museum director, ever the polished professional, stood silent for a moment, his mind clearly racing to regain control of the situation. But the truth was inescapable now, and he knew it. With a slow, measured breath, he took a step forward. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice more composed than the others, but lacking its earlier edge of quiet authority. "I take full responsibility for the way you were treated today. My staff and I should have extended the same courtesy to you that we would to any respected scholar, patron, or guest." There was another pause before he continued. "I deeply regret that we failed to do so." For the first time since this confrontation had begun, Malcolm saw something genuine in Langley's expression. It wasn't just damage control anymore. There was something else. A recognition of the gravity of what had happened. A beat of silence passed. Then, slowly, Langley extended a hand. "If you're willing, I would like to personally apologize and ensure that nothing like this happens again in my museum." Malcolm considered him for a moment. Then, finally, he reached forward and shook Langley's hand. The message was clear. This wasn't just about an apology. This was about change. As Malcolm shook Langley's hand, a quiet ripple spread through the gathered crowd. The guests who had watched everything unfold, some with curiosity, others with silent judgment, now found themselves grappling with a stark realization. They had been wrong. The wealthy couple, who had earlier exchanged amused glances at Malcolm's presence, now looked thoroughly unsettled. The woman clutched her designer purse a little tighter, as if suddenly uncomfortable in her own skin. The man beside her cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly before finally mustering the courage to speak. I have to admit," he said hesitantly, his voice lacking its earlier air of quiet superiority. "I thought you were just another visitor trying to sound knowledgeable," he exhaled, shaking his head. "I shouldn't have assumed." Malcolm turned to him, offering nothing but a patient, knowing look. Nearby, the elderly gentleman with the silver-rimmed glasses let out a low chuckle, though not in amusement, more in quiet disbelief. "I've been coming to this museum for years," he murmured half to himself, "and yet, I've never seen a moment quite like this." His wife, standing beside him, sighed. "We were so quick to judge," she admitted, "and yet, we had no idea we were in the presence of the very person responsible for this exhibit." She turned to Malcolm, offering a genuine, if slightly embarrassed, smile. "You handled yourself with far more grace than I think many of us would have." Malcolm inclined his head slightly. Experience teaches patience. The younger couple, who had once whispered about him from a distance, now seemed eager to distance themselves from their earlier assumptions. The woman gave a small, apologetic nod before pulling at her partner's sleeve, as if urging him to move along before their own biases became any more obvious. But perhaps the most meaningful reaction came from the older woman, the one who had engaged Malcolm in conversation about the scepter before knowing who he was. She smiled, a look of deep respect in her eyes. "I suspected you knew more than you let on," she said softly. "But I didn't expect this." Malcolm chuckled lightly. Neither did they. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. What had started as silent doubt had now turned into quiet admiration. But more importantly, it had turned into reflection. People weren't just looking at him differently now. They were looking at themselves differently, too. Langley, having now fully realized his misjudgment, straightened his posture and cleared his throat. Gone was the distant professionalism, the guarded skepticism. In its place was something else, respect. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable note of humility. "As one of our most valued patrons, it would be an honor to offer you a private tour of our restricted collections." A few audible gasps could be heard among the onlookers. The restricted collections were a privilege reserved for esteemed scholars, major donors, and select museum personnel. The fact that Langley was now extending this invitation so publicly was as much a gesture of apology as it was a statement. One that made it clear to everyone in the room that Malcolm was not just another guest. Malcolm regarded Langley for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond. He let the silence stretch just long enough before offering a small, measured smile. "I'd like that," he said finally. Langley nodded, visibly relieved, and gestured toward a side entrance marked, "Authorized personnel only." "Please," he said, stepping aside, no longer leading but now inviting Malcolm to step forward first. Ms. Reynolds and the museum guide, still reeling from their earlier mistakes, exchanged quiet glances before falling into step behind them. Their previous attempts to dismiss Malcolm had now transformed into an almost reverent attentiveness, as if unsure how to make up for their misjudgment but desperate to do so. As they walked toward the restricted section, the guests who had once doubted Malcolm now watched with admiration. Some even whispered among themselves, marveling at how quickly the power dynamic had shifted. The museum doors that had once seemed guarded against him were now being opened with the highest level of respect. And Malcolm, ever composed, stepped through them, not as an outsider, but as the man who had belonged here all along. As Malcolm stepped into the private collection, the rich scent of aged parchment and polished wood filled the air. This was where the museum kept its most valuable artifacts, pieces too fragile, too rare, or too politically significant to be displayed in the main halls. It was a privilege granted only to the most trusted individuals. But before Langley could launch into his tour, Malcolm turned to face him and the staff members who had followed. The weight of the moment settled over the room. "Before we go any further," Malcolm said, his voice calm but intentional, "I think there's something more important to address." Langley hesitated, then nodded. "Of course," he said. "Please." Malcolm let his gaze sweep over the people standing before him. Staff, guests, individuals who had all, in their own way, played a part in today's events. Some had questioned him openly, others through silent assumptions. And now they were all listening. "This isn't the first time I've experienced something like this," Malcolm said plainly, "and I doubt it'll be the last." Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, knowing exactly what he meant. "I've walked into places like this my whole life and felt the weight of being judged before I even spoke a word. People see me and they form conclusions about who I am, what I know, what I deserve. It happens in museums, in boardrooms, in places of influence where people assume that knowledge, wealth, or power only look a certain way." He paused, letting his words settle in. "But here's the truth," he continued. "Bias, whether conscious or not, limits us all. It creates barriers where there should be none. It stops us from seeing potential, from hearing voices that could teach us something new. And if there's one place where learning should be limitless, it's in a museum." Langley inhaled slowly, his expression unreadable but intent. Malcolm gestured toward the artifacts around them. "History doesn't belong to one kind of person. Knowledge isn't reserved for a select few. And respect, true respect, should never be something that has to be earned. It should be the default." A heavy silence filled the room. Ms. Reynolds looked down, her earlier sharp confidence replaced with quiet reflection. The museum guide swallowed hard, visibly processing his own role in what had happened. Even some of the guests, who had once watched him with mild amusement, now lowered their eyes. "I don't share this to humiliate anyone," Malcolm said, his tone unwavering. "I share it because change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we acknowledge our mistakes and do better." He let his words settle, then exhaled softly, allowing a small, knowing smile to touch his lips. "I don't hold anger toward anyone here," he finished. "I just hope that next time, whether it's me or someone else, assumptions won't come before respect." Langley, for the first time, looked at Malcolm not as a guest, not as a donor, but as a man who had just taught them all something they would never forget. And for that, he nodded not out of formality but out of genuine understanding. In the weeks that followed Malcolm's visit, the museum underwent a quiet but significant transformation. The events of that day had left a lasting impact, not just on the individuals involved, but on the institution itself. At the next board meeting, Langley brought forth an initiative, one that had been long overdue. "We pride ourselves on being a place of knowledge," he told the assembled trustees and senior staff. "But knowledge means nothing if we fail to practice the values that history teaches us. We made mistakes that day, and we have a responsibility to ensure they don't happen again." The board agreed unanimously. A new policy was implemented, requiring all museum employees, from security to curators, to undergo mandatory bias training. The goal wasn't just to prevent future incidents, but to foster a culture of respect and inclusion for all visitors, regardless of background. Museum staff were also given expanded cultural competency workshops, designed to help them recognize and challenge unconscious biases in their interactions with guests. New hiring practices were introduced to ensure a more diverse and inclusive team, better reflecting the very history they were preserving. Additionally, exhibit descriptions were reevaluated to include a broader range of scholarly perspectives, ensuring that artifacts like the scepter Malcolm had donated were presented with a more complete and nuanced history. Langley himself took a personal interest in overseeing these changes. He knew that a single moment of reckoning wasn't enough. Change required action, commitment, and time. Months later, Malcolm received a formal letter from the museum. It wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of growth. And that, more than anything, was proof that history was still being written, not just in books and exhibits, but in the choices people made every day. Malcolm's story was more than just an incident at a museum. It was a lesson, a mirror reflecting the quiet biases that shape everyday interactions. What had begun as a routine visit had revealed a painful truth. People judge before they understand. They look at a person's appearance, their demeanor, their background, and decide, often without realizing it, whether that person belongs. The museum staff hadn't seen Malcolm for who he truly was. They had seen only what their assumptions allowed them to see. A well-dressed black man in a prestigious museum, looking too closely at priceless artifacts. Not a scholar, not a patron, not someone worthy of respect. And yet, when the truth came out, their entire perception had shifted. But should respect only be given when someone has proven they deserve it? That was the real question. True humility is treating every person with dignity, not because of what they own, what they've achieved, or what title they hold, but because they are human. Because every person carries knowledge, experiences, and worth that can't be seen at first glance. Malcolm hadn't demanded their respect. He had simply shown them why they should have given it from the start. And in the end, their lesson wasn't just about him. It was about them, about how they saw the world, and about how they would choose to see people from that moment forward. Malcolm's experience at the museum was not just a personal struggle. It was a reflection of a larger issue that existed far beyond those walls. Bias, whether intentional or unconscious, had the power to shape realities. It determined who received respect and who had to fight for it. It decided who was given the benefit of the doubt and who was met with skepticism. And more often than not, it led to injustice. The museum staff had not set out to discriminate that day. They had simply acted on assumptions that had been ingrained by societal norms, by history, by a system that had long favored certain voices over others. But assumptions have consequences. What if Malcolm had not been patient? What if he had simply walked away, never revealing his role as a benefactor? Would they have ever questioned their actions? Would they have recognized their bias? Or would they have simply gone on, believing that their judgments had been justified? This was the danger of unchecked prejudice. It didn't just cause discomfort. It denied opportunities, erased voices, and reinforced barriers that should never have existed in the first place. A truly just society is one that does not require individuals to prove their worth before they are treated with dignity. It is one where fairness is not given selectively, but by default. Because history has already seen the cost of injustice, and if people do not actively work against it, they will only continue repeating the same mistakes.